Let's look at how we can create a list from a string, and then after we do that, we'll look at how we can create a list from items in a file. I have identified a variable called elements, and it contains a string. Okay, it starts with a double quote, and we have some characters, and it stops with a double quote. So this is not a list, although you see the commas separating these things. There are no square brackets on the end, so this is not a list because the syntax is different. So this is a string. But we can make a nice list out of this by using the split method. So the split method is what I really want to introduce here. So let's create a list from this string using split. The line of code that we need for this looks like this. So I've got a different variable. I'm going to call it element underscore list. Then I'm going to use this string elements that's defined above and the method dot split. So the dot split method takes one argument, and that's a character. So I've got a single quote, a comma, and a single quote. You could use double quotes as well. So the character that you put here is where you want to split the string. So whenever we encounter a comma in this string, then it's going to take the data up to that point, which is one of the elements, and make that an element of a string. So this character can be anything you want. And in fact, a space would work nicely here as well. So we could remove the commas and put spaces in and get the same result. So after we have split the elements of this, we split this string up into its components, then they are stored in the list element underscore list. Now let's just print those out so we can see what that looks like. So let's paste the code in to do that. So I'm going to print out the original string there with print elements. Then I'm going to print out the list, element list, and then I'm just going to skip a line for the next stuff that we do. So let's run the program and look at the output. And I'll bring that over. So here is the output. So the top line, that's the string. So it just has the contents of everything between the double quotes. But when I print out the element list, element underscore list, then you see it's in list notation. So we have the brackets on each end, and we have the quotes for each of the elements, and they're separated by commas in the list. So we can use split to split some information and put it into a list. So you probably have picked up by now that lists are very powerful within Python in order to organize your data. Now, let's look at another example where we're going to look at data from a file, take that in, and make it into a list. So I put a comment, you can split a line from a file into a list too. In this case, I've got a little file here that's got several lines, and these are just postal codes. So these are the state codes for the 50 states, plus we have the District of Columbia in here. So that means we have a total of 51. So this is organized into 10 lines, and the last one has 6 codes in it instead of 5. So what I want to do with this is I want to read in this entire file, all 10 lines, and I want to make a list out of them. So how do we go about doing that? If we want to read data from a file, then we have to open the file. So I've got a file called postalcodes.txt that we just looked at, and that's saved in the temp folder on my C drive, and the file pointer is called codes this time. Now that we have the file open, let's look at a simple for loop that lets us read the items from the file and just print them back to the screen. Okay, so here's the code for that. So for loop, like we've seen before, we'll have for some variable here in codes that we just want to print out the line. So let's see what that gives us. So this comes as no surprise. We can read in the data from the file, we print it back to the screen. We get the extra lines here because we have the \n from the file, plus the print statement always puts another \n, so that's why we get the spaces in between. So one thing we'd want to do is to do the R strip to take away that extra \n. But anyway, this shows us we can read from the file, but this is not a list yet. It's just printing out what's in the file. Well, let's modify this for loop so that we can create a list. Before I print out the line, in fact, I'll change that a little bit too. Let's look at the code and line things up here. Okay, so for line encodes, we'll read one line from the file. Then we're going to remove that \n as we've done many times already with our strip. And here's the new thing. This is split. Okay, so I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to use a new variable called list underscore codes or line underscore codes. But this will be a list. The split operation is going to use a space in order to separate the items from the file as they come in. So this will separate all of those state codes into single elements that will go in the list. Now, instead of printing out the line this time, let's print out the line codes. So I'll change that so we can see what these lists look like. Now let's run the program. Now we have the output. So here we have the string that we separated earlier, and now we have the input from the file. Now take a look at this. You'll see that we have several lists. So we have this one, we began with the first 5 states. So we have the bracket on the left, the bracket on the right, and then the elements of the list separated with spaces and commas. So this is the list notation that hopefully you're becoming familiar with. And since we had to go through the loop for each line, we have a bunch of lists. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 10 lists. But what I really wanted was to have one list with all of those postal codes all together in one big list. So how do we do that? Well, one thing we could do is, as we're creating this, we could concatenate these lists together to make one big list. So that's one thing we could do. But there's another way we can go about it as well. So let's take a look at that. So one technique we can use is this. I'm going to make another list that doesn't have anything in it. So I'm going to call this state codes, and I'm going to set it equal to just these 2 square brackets. If you do that, then you create a list that doesn't have any elements. So you have an empty list. Now, as we go through each line, and the for loop reads one line at a time, and then it makes a list. So we ended up with 10 lists. I didn't really want 10 lists. I wanted 1. So as I split apart each line to get the elements from that line, then I'm going to append those to another list called state codes. Or I said append, I'm really going to do what we call an extend operation. And then we'll print that out. So let's insert that in here. Okay, so let's paste that in. And I'm going to use this empty list, state codes. I'm going to extend it with each new list that I create, which is called line codes. Okay, now one more time, let's look at this. We'll go through the loop, and we will get one line from the file. Then we're going to extract or remove that \n using our strip. We still have the data in line. It's not a list yet. Then I'm going to convert that to a list using split, and I'll save it in line codes. Okay, now previously we had 10 of those, and as we go through the loop, we'll end up with 10 again. But each time I make this list line codes, I'm going to extend the state codes list using the extend method. So I'm going to do the first 5, then extend it with the next 5 until I get to the very end. Okay, now I want to get outside the loop, but I want to print this as we go. I want to print the state codes after the loop, and we'll see what we get there. Okay, so after the loop, let's print out our list now of state codes. So this should be a list that contains 51 items because it has all those 51 state codes from the file. So let's run the program and look at the output. Now we have the output, so let's bring it over. And this is a long list. So you can tell that we start with the left square bracket, and then we have all of those codes, all those mail codes, and they're separated by commas, and each one has its quote as you would expect. And then on the far right side, we have the closing bracket for the list. So now I have a list that's made up of all the postal codes that we have for the United States. So we have 51 of those now in a list. Now, it's very convenient to work with a list, as you probably have picked up by now. And the for loop is the powerful loop that we use to process a list. So here's another trick you can use. Just make yourself an empty list, and then you can add on to that list, making a larger list as you go. Then finally we print that out down here. So this then shows you how to use the split method that's available within Python. In the examples that we've seen so far, we have used the for loop to go all the way through a file and read in all the data, or we have gone through a list from the beginning to the end, or in some cases I guess we've extracted just one element from a list using the square bracket notation. But there's another tool that you can use that will let you get portions of a list or certain items from a file without having to go through the entire file. So that's known as the range feature in Python. So let's take a look at range and see how it works. So in this example, we'll be looking at range. So let's put our comment in here that we'll be working with the range feature of Python. Let's get a for loop to illustrate how range works. So let's paste in our for loop, and let's examine it. So in this case, we have for in range 6. What this does is it starts with a value of 0 for n, and it goes up to the number 6, actually 6 minus 1, since we start counting with 0 in computer science. So what this will do, it prints out the numbers 0 through 5. So I'm just printing those out to the screen so you can see how this works. So if you wanted to just have a loop set up to go a certain number of times, then this is a way you can do it. Just use some variable here, use the variable range, and put the number there where you want it to stop. So this will just print out the numbers 0 through 5. Let's run it and make sure that that does print out the numbers 0 through 5. So let's bring the output over. So we have the list from our previous examples, but down at the bottom you see we have the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's produced by this loop for n in range 6. So it starts at 0 and it goes to 5. So if you only wanted to go through a loop 6 times, this is one way to do it. Now let's look at another example. This example is going to do the same thing, but in a slightly different way. If you do not use any other numbers in the range, then it assumes you're starting with 0. You can give a starting position and an ending position, also similar to what we did when we were getting a substring out of a larger string. But in this case, we use a comma instead of a colon as we had in the case of strings. So this is indicating that we want n to begin with 0 and we want to go up to 6. But as you know already, that means we'll stop at 6, but we won't print it. So this also prints 0 through 5. Okay, now let's look at another loop before I run it and we see the output. So let's look at another example of range. So we can paste that in here. And this shows that I want to begin in with the number 4, and we're still going to go to 6. So this will print out 4 and 5. Now I know I'm repeating myself here, but remember that the number you put here, it doesn't actually go to that number, it goes to one less than that number. And we're just printing out the numbers here. We're not really using n for anything just yet. Now let's see what this output gives us. I'll bring up the output window. And now let's see if I can line these up. So for the first loop, we had 0 through 5. And then in the second one, where we have n in range 0, 6, we get the same thing, okay, 0 through 5, because if you don't specify a beginning number, then n is assumed to be 0. Then, in the last loop, we start in with 4 and we go up to 6. So that will give us the last value, or the last output, which is just 4 and 5. So you can use this range and give it a starting number and give it an ending number, and by doing that you can write or use these as indices and get a subset from a list, for example. Now let's look at another example. So let's paste in this loop, and let's line it up a little better than that. So in this case, I have 3 numbers. So this is also similar to what we did when we're getting a substring from a larger string. You have the beginning number, you have the ending number, and then you can skip through this. So this is skipping by 3 each time. So this is, we could call it a step. So the full definition of the range, whenever you want to use range, is you can give it a starting index or starting number, the ending number, and then some step that you use when you're going through this loop. So what this does, it prints out the numbers 0 through 11, skipping 3 each time. So we get 0, and then 3, and then 6, 6, and then 9. Now it doesn't print out 12. Why? Well, because when we put the 12 here, that's the stopping point. So the last number is actually 11. So let's run the program and look at the output from these loops. So let's bring up the output. And we have quite a bit of them now. So we have the output again from the first loop and the second loop and the third loop that printed out the 4 and the 5. But the last one shows we do print out 0, 3, 6, and 9. So if you want to use the full power of range, then you can use all 3 of these numbers. Well, those are examples that just showed the mechanics of how the range operator works, or the range feature of Python works. Let's just use it in a few examples using our state codes list that we just created. So let's put in another for loop. So for n in the range 0 through 5, so what does that give you? The numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's use that as an index into our list of state codes. So I'm not going to print the entire list of state codes. I'm going to go through this list and I'll print out the first 5 one at a time. So let's look at how that output appears. So let's bring up the output window. And here you can see the output from that. So from this last loop, we use the n variable as an index into our state codes list, but we just get the 5 codes. So you can use this range feature to pull out just a subset from a list if you don't want to see everything in the list. Okay, let's look at a couple more examples before we close up. Okay, let's paste in our for loop here. And this time I want to use this for n in range 10 through 15. I want to print out those state codes. So again, think about what index we're seeing here. So we're going to print out 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. So we'll print out those 5 state codes from this example. Now here those are. So from this last loop, we get the codes for Georgia, Hawaii, and so on here. So we get these 5 state codes from that loop. So we're starting at 10 and we go up to index 14. Now let's look at one last example of this where we'll use all 3 of the numbers that you can use with the range feature. So let's paste that in. And in this case I am using all 3 numbers within range. So n will start with 26 and it goes up to 1 less than this one, which is 51, and I'm skipping over 4 each time. So this is going to print out several of these state codes in the upper half of our list of state codes. So 26 through 51, and we're going to skip 4 each time. Okay, so let's look at the result of this list, or this loop. And here's the output from that. So in this last case, we get Montana, I guess MT's Montana. So that's number 26, and then we skip 4 to get New Jersey, we skip 4 to get North Dakota, and so on. And then in the end, we get Wyoming. So this illustrates here another tool that you can use with a loop and with a list. So your toolbox of programming tools that you're using with Python is growing pretty rapidly now. So if you have a list, then you have a lot of tools that you can use to manipulate that list. So you can see why the list feature of Python is one of the features you're most likely to use. And these loops with range and other tools that we've seen are very powerful in letting you manipulate the data in a list. So that's enough for this video.